Welcome to another episode of Out of the Blank Podcast. Claudine, it's a pleasure to have you on the show. Would you like to introduce yourself to everyone out there listening?
Sure, I'm Claudine Burnett. I'm a retired librarian who spent over 25 years going through old newspapers from Southern California, and I've written several books based on that research.
I got to ask about the Prohibition era because you wrote about Long Beach. Now, I've talked about Washington, D.C., I've talked about like specific areas, but what was going on in Long Beach?
Long Beach was quite unique. First of all, Long Beach was known as a prohibition city. We had some of the leaders of the Prohibitionist Party living here in the city. The city was alcohol free. We had, for instance, Marie Bream, who was the first woman vice presidential candidate who lived in Long Beach, and several others. So Long Beach was a hotbed for the Prohibition movement, but not everybody agreed. And so there was an awful lot of underground activities going on here that had already been perfected by the time that Prohibition went into effect in January of 1920. And if you'd like, I'll show you a picture. This is, can you see that?
I could when you back it up a little. There you go.
Okay. It's not really working, is
It
it?
might not show up too well on there.
Okay, this was a picture of the Long Beach Pike. And that was an amusement area that was built in Long Beach in 1902. So in my book, I talk about what was going on there. There were already underground operations in effect before Prohibition because people wanted to go there and have a drink. So there was an underground movement already in existence in Long Beach. So when Prohibition went into effect, they were all set up with their speakeasies and other things.
So were they? So you mentioned them being set up before. So they were already aware that this was going to happen. Like, was it one of the first places to shut down during the pro era? I know there were some states that kind of held out a little bit longer.
It was already underground, and they had the police and other people that were there doing takes, money and stuff like that before. And that continued when Prohibition went into effect. So Long Beach was ahead of everybody else in having underground operations because they had already been doing that since 1901 when the anti-liquor law went into effect.
Now, like when it comes to the culture of Long Beach, I mean, did you have a lot of people that were? I mean, was a big alcohol problem before? Like, how bad did it really impact Long Beach? A lot of businesses.
Well, Long Beach was settled by a lot of people from the Midwest, and they were very righteous and Christian, and they did not like alcohol. In fact, Long Beach actually was disincorporated over the liquor question in the 1880s because they voted to allow one saloon in town. And that one saloon actually paid enough taxes for people to go ahead and not have to pay any personal taxes or anything like that. And just the mere fact of allowing that one saloon caused the city to disincorporate. But when they found that their money was going to the county and none of the services were being provided, they decided to reincorporate again, allow that one saloon back because the saloon had a contract until 1900. And then they voted with the new political party in power not to allow that saloon after 1901. So, but still people wanted a drink. At that time, too, the amusement area known as the Pike was being developed, and that's where a lot of underground operations took place, as well as a lot of murders, as you can read in my book, Prohibition Madness.
I got to ask about just the underground creation of alcohol or the way that they're trying to, I guess, deal with it during the whole Prohibition era. I mean, who was like, is it like the underground press where magazines had to go underground a little bit and be able to kind of produce stuff?
No, they were just underground operations. One of these places where you would knock on the door like you see in the movies and they would let you on in. And so it especially got bad. Now in Long Beach, Long Beach continued to grow. It started in 1882. By 1890, it had a population of 500. By 1910, it was described by the U.S. Census Bureau as the fastest growing city in the nation, and it had 2,272 people. And that was because of the railroads. We now had railroads. We now had a Pacific Electric red car system, and the harbor opened. And that brought in a tremendous influx of people. And it continued to grow. And then in 1921, oil was discovered on Signal Hill. And the population in Long Beach in 1920 was around 55,000. By 1922, after oil had taken off, it had gone to 126,000 people.
Holy crap.
And yes, and this brought in an awful lot of people that were considered outsiders, people who wanted to have liquor. And that's when some of the underground dealing started to take place. Now, Signal Hill was notorious for all of their speakeasies and whatnot. It was pretty open. And there were a lot of oil workers that were there from all over the country. And after putting in a hard day's work, they just wanted to have a drink. So Signal Hill was also notorious, as well as some of the outlying areas that were not yet annexed to Long Beach, such as the Los Cerritos area, which is now part of Long Beach. Now, it's very interesting because some of the most prominent men in Long Beach were involved in what was the illicit trade to bring liquor into the United States. One of them was a man named Curtis, who owned one of the canneries down by the harbor area. And he was arrested when there was a raid on unloading the ships. Now, so there were the importers. Now, the importers were respectable people that you might sit next to in church, and they saw nothing wrong with this. For instance, you could buy liquor in Canada for about $15 back then. And if you were somewhere here in Southern California, you could have it delivered to your door for $65. So it was an open trade. No, it wasn't kept secret, and the police were in on it. A problem that the importers had were, what were they called? Oh, they were called hijackers. And what would happen would be you would have like a landing of liquor onto one of our beaches, and it would be loaded into a cart, into a truck, and then the hijackers would take it over. And so these were people that would steal the liquor from the importers. Yeah, did you have a question?
No, you were covering your phone with your scarf. I couldn't hear you.
Oh, okay. So the hijackers would go ahead and take the liquor that the importers had paid money to have brought into Southern California, and then they would go ahead and they had an underground market. So there were a lot of battles that went on that were never really reported to the police between the importers and the hijackers over the liquor. And so that's why the murders increased, and there was an awful lot of illegal activity that was going on. Now, the other kind of way to get alcohol was to make it yourself. So we had the moonshiners, and I'm sure you've heard of them. And so they would get the grain and go ahead and, make their liquor in some out of the way place. And then the police would go after them, and they could usually tell where a still was by the smell. But the moonshiners, they were pretty adept at covering it. Burning rubber was one way to cover the smell. And then another way was to use lime to mask the odor. But then they had to get rid of the mash. And so they would go on out and dump it somewhere out in the open. But it was something that cows would eat, for instance, or flies or birds. So all of that the police had to do was follow a drunken cow to where the still was. Or another way was if a fly landed on your arm and you were able to swat it and kill it, you knew that you were pretty close to a still.
I have to ask, what surprised you more, the moonshiners' kind of ways to deal with the smell of the alcohol that they were making, or about the police kind of neglect on some of the crime that was going on? Because I would have to think that if they were getting a piece of some of the alcohol thing, either they didn't agree with it or if they were just getting a cut of it, I mean, it would be less, they'd have to look the other way with their operations that were going down at the dock.
Well, it just depended on how much money they were being paid by the person that was either importing it or making moonshine. Oh, and I have to tell you another thing that I found most interesting is that we had the drugless drugstores. And so there were drugstores that popped up here and there. And actually, they had no drugs inside of them, but only moonshine liquor or imported liquor where people could come on in and pretend like they were filling a prescription, because you were still allowed to have alcohol if your doctor prescribed it for you.
Wow.
So I really like the idea of the drugless drugstores.
How did that, so wait, did the drug, so do you know who, did you look into anybody who was in charge of like the drugless drugstores, or anybody like their background? Was it just common citizens?
Yeah, it was just common business. It was another way, just business was another business that just went on. So, yeah, there were a number of them. It wasn't like it was a chain like Rite Aid or CVS or anything like that. Just individual little stores that would pop up so you could get your liquor from the drugstores. But did you want to hear about the gambling ships too?
Yeah.
Those were, you could also, beginning about 1928, get on a little ferry or a little boat to go on out to one of the gambling ships that were stationed off of Southern California. In Long Beach, we had the first. It was called the Johanna Smith, and people would just get on these little carriers, take them out to the ship, and the ship was outside the control of local authorities. So you could, get on one of these little roundabouts, go on out to the ship, and gamble as well as drink. And there was quite a bit of activity that was going on, including murders, which I write about in my book. And again, there were the gangster element that was competing just to see who could control this market. Eventually, this was interesting. The Johanna Smith had a fire, and the local authorities would not go on out and save the ship because, hey, it was outside their authority. So she sunk off of the coast of Seal Beach, and she had allegedly like $25,000 back then in gold and other things that were on ships, silver dollars. And some of that is still lying off of our coast.
Huh.
But our waters are deep, not like off of the Mediterranean, or excuse me, the Caribbean. So yeah, some of it's still there. They just have to discover it.
When it talks about the gang element, did you look into anybody like, Al Capone? I know you mentioned about Fatty Arbuckle, which is a name I've only heard really in like pop culture references. I haven't really looked into that guy at all.
Well, Al Capone was imprisoned here in Long Beach on Terminal Island. And he was released, and he came to Long Beach, and he stayed at the Blackstone Hotel before they took him back to Chicago. But we also had other criminal elements. Later in the days of Prohibition, there were too many independents, and the Chicago mob came in, and they started to want to consolidate these different groups into one. They wanted to be in control, just like they were in Chicago. So we had one case, one fella, his name was Ralph Sheldon, who during one raid on an incoming liquor shipment shot and killed a Long Beach police officer, William Wagoner. And that was quite a sensation. And it meant then that the local authorities, who might have been turning their eye the other way to all of this activity because of public pressure and the murder of a police officer, decided to pay attention, and Sheldon was arrested. But he got off. It might have been because the names of the jurors were printed in the newspaper along with their addresses. And a
Jeez.
lot of them got visits from Sheldon's associates. So Sheldon was not convicted of shooting police officer Wagner. His defense was that there was so much going on in the way of shooting at that time that who could know that maybe it was a fellow police officer that had shot Wagner instead of him. So anyway, that continued.
That's crazy that they printed the jurors' names and they printed their addresses. That's just, I don't know. To me, that just seems like someone that was like, look, we just don't want them interfering or having this kind of war that went on. So you just print something in the magazine. And I think enough people will be like, yeah, I'm going to go this way.
Well, it's interesting because one of the things that I did in finding out all of the information about what was going on was go through newspapers, and I compiled Long Beach Public Library's Long Beach History Index. And I kept uncovering all sorts of stories. And up until about the 1960s, whenever anything happened to anybody, if they died, if their son went off to war, if there was a murder or suicide, the address was always printed. And that stopped about the mid 1960s when they realized, hey, it's an obituary. Somebody's address is printed. Somebody could go and, rob them while everybody's at the funeral. So yeah, printing addresses was really quite a common practice. And in fact, when I was working at Long Beach Public Library, I was in charge of our literature and history department, which also included the local history section. A lot of people would come on in and want to know about the history of their house. So when I went through and I indexed the local newspapers, which took me about 25 years whenever I could find free time, I always included the address that was printed in the newspaper. And that way people could come in and we could do a keyword search and find out about maybe a suicide or a murder that had happened at a house, or somebody that had just died and they wanted to know more. So that was something special that we did when we indexed the local newspapers.
Besides that change in the 60s when they stopped printing the obituary, did you notice significant differences from the reporting back during the Prohibition era compared to maybe later Long Beach?
Okay, well, they still printed obituaries. They just did not give out the address of the person that had died. Oh yeah, there was quite a bit of a difference in the local newspapers from the 1920s. A lot of them were more sensationalist. Of course, there was much more that was going on back in the 1920s and 30s than there was in the 1960s. So yeah, the newspaper coverage was different. But in the 1920s and 30s, sensationalism was what people wanted. A murder was really interesting to people.
It's not that different from today. Not that different from today.
Not that different. But one of the ones that I talk about in my book was the torso murder. And I am just amazed that no one has done a documentary or a film on that one. It was so interesting. It happened, about 1932 when a young man was out in the Los Angeles River following a flood, and he was just looking for things that might have washed down the river that he could, find and play with. And he saw what he thought was a mannequin. And when he actually pulled it out of the river, he found out that it was the torso of a murdered woman. And so this captivated the entire Southern California, probably the United States. I'm sure you would find articles about it in other newspapers. But so the look was out to try to find out who this woman could be. I mean, there were no arms or legs. It was just the torso. There was no head. So the Los Angeles Examiner they put out a reward of $1,000, which was unbelievable back then, for anybody that would come up with some further information. Well, about 4 weeks later, there were some boys from Long Beach who were again playing down by the river, and they were poking around, and they thought they found a turtle shell. And when they looked, it was the head of a woman. And here these boys were, they were like 9, 10, and 11, 3 of them. So they put the head on the stick and went running up to the road, and they stopped a motorist and said, "Look what we have." And she screamed and immediately took them to the police department. And it was the head of the murder victim. And I won't go into details about how she was murdered. You can find that in the book. But basically, it was the first time that dental records were used in order to identify a person. So that was also a first in the history during that era.
Was that a mob related thing, a gang related thing? I'm very interested in
No, it
organized
wasn't.
crime.
It wasn't. It was her doctor boyfriend, and boy was he clever. And he kept saying that she was alive, that she had to leave because of some problems that she was having. Anyway, Robbie, read the book. You'll find out more.
I guess through your archival research, I mean, did you find any journals? Did you go through, or is it just strictly newspapers?
Okay, one thing that I try to do is I only use primary source material. That's because I'm a research librarian. And I find if I used secondary sources, a lot of that is incorrect. For instance, when I was writing Prohibition Madness, I went back to a book that was published in the 1940s, and it was called LA Murders. And it had stories from some of the most respectable, well-known mystery writers and journalists that were around back there, including Raymond Chandler and some of the others. And when I went through what they had written, it was nothing like what I found by going through the local newspapers. It was completely off. And then I realized later that they were under a deadline. They didn't have access to digitized newspapers like we do today. And so they just went ahead and made stuff up and tried to fill in the pieces.
Claudine, you might want to move your phone away from your scarf again. There you go.
Okay, so that's why primary sources, newspapers, are of primary importance, at least in my research. And the other thing is that you find when you look at journals or talk to people, their memory has a tendency to embellish actual details. And so I would try to look through newspapers, several newspapers, to try to get different views on what was happening. At least I was getting the exact dates and a little bit more about what the police had done, or more about the murder suspect than people remembered or wrote about in later books or journals.
Now, you stumbled across your first material for, I mean, like when you first started doing this, that you didn't have a bias in any certain direction you wanted to go. Always find that you find the best stuff. Like I look through the JFK files and stuff when they release files because I have an interest in JFK. But I look at like the documents, but I don't have a bias. Like I don't look to an individual. If this is an important name, I got to click this, or I got to scan through all these documents for this name. I kind of just click and just slowly work my way down the list. And I find that some of the stuff, the most interesting stuff, to at least depict the times a little bit better, is the stuff that I don't already know or I'm not searching out for. I have no bias in anything.
Well, it's good that you're going to records such as you mentioned with JFK, because those are testimonies and other things. Those are primary source materials that you're looking at. But it's the secondary ones that I try to stay away from or try to go ahead and clear up as well. It's like some of the murder cases that you'll find in my book are what I researched and found by going through documents versus what Raymond Chandler and some of the others wrote about in LA Murders.
Did it ever change your perspective on where you live, learning all the history behind, Long Beach?
Well, it's interesting because we're in an age now where people want to learn about local history. And yes, I have a good following. When I started writing books, I already knew a number of the newspapermen and whatnot who had come in and done research in my department. And yes, local history is a big topic right now. And Long Beach has a tendency to get overshadowed by Los Angeles, even though we're a population of 460,000 and we have a lot of unique events. And sometimes I've become upset because everybody thinks of Southern California as being like Los Angeles, and Long Beach gets overlooked. For instance, the Smithsonian brought out the first airplane that had flown across country, the Vin Fizz, on display here. And nowhere did they know that Cal Rogers' plane had come from Long Beach, that he had crashed in Long Beach following his cross-country flight, and that he had actually landed in Long Beach, whereas everybody else said he just landed in Los Angeles, because to most people, Los Angeles and Long Beach are synonymous. So I try to get the record straight on what actual accomplishments Long Beach has made versus, and separating it from Los Angeles.
Is that like a media thing, or is that just what is that? Like, why are they attributing so many things to Los Angeles? Is that just because it's more known?
Well, a lot of it's coming from the East Coast. They have been the writers of what's been happening a lot in Southern California. And they probably just have been on a deadline and haven't gotten it straight. But I was really, and so was the community, upset that the Smithsonian actually had the Cal Rogers plane, and they did not know, first of all, that it had been donated by Long Beach, and that he had ended his cross-country flight in Long Beach.
Did you contact them and figure it out?
Oh, yes. I contacted them, yeah. And went ahead and put in some Wikipedia suggestions and whatnot. So, yeah, Long Beach has a lot of accomplishments that are separate from Los Angeles, including aviation. We were one of the first municipal airports in California. That's Long Beach Airport, which is still in existence. And of course, we always had the oil industry. We had a harbor. We had the Navy, Douglas Aircraft Company, a lot of things in Long Beach that are unique to Long Beach, and in many cases, the first. We even had a disease named after Long Beach.
I didn't know that
by one of the researchers. Yeah. I can't remember what it is, but it's Long Beach something or another. And a color. We also had a color named after Long Beach. It was a tan color that reflected the color of the sand that was here.
I can relate to at least your personal pride where you live as well. So, I mean, I live in Maryland, but whenever you say Maryland, people go, "Oh, Baltimore." It's like, look, that's not it. We're Maryland. That's what we are. It's like, I'm from Ocean City, Maryland. It's kind of a small town, so you end up kind of getting stuck here. But I mean, you mentioned about your following, but I was asking more from your personal experience. I mean, do you feel, I guess, more pride in knowing this information and history about where you live as well, too? I mean, you're doing an important service, being able to get the word out on a lot of, I guess, history that's not really told.
Yes, indeed. I do feel a lot of pride. And I continue with my monthly articles that I write for 2 local newspapers. I always write about topics that might be of interest to people. And for instance, right now I'm working on another book. This will be my 13th that I'm writing because a friend of mine had started it, and she died of COVID in 1920. And it was her family history. And they were some of the first people to settle in Long Beach in 1889. So I promised her before she died that I would finish the book. And so her daughter gave me 5 boxes of all of her notes that also included diaries from family members. Her one aunt, Ivy, had started to write a book. And so that's what I'm working on now. But again, I'm finding that you really need to check primary source materials. For instance, Ivy wrote that the family landed at Ellis Island, but they came in 1889 and Ellis Island wasn't open then. It was 1882 that Ellis Island opened, and they had to go through Castle Garden. So even the name of the ship that Ivy said the family came over on was wrong, because I had to check census records in order to verify when they came.
Is it possible that the record could be wrong as well too? Like if they called it something later and they might have got the date wrong and when it was established?
I'm sorry, what would have been the date?
You said it wasn't named Ellis Island until later. Could that be a possible date mix up in the record?
Oh, no, it's all over the internet. Just look up the history of Ellis Island, and you'll find that before that, 1882, I believe, everybody landed at Castle Garden, which was in New York. And back then, nobody needed to have a visa or anything to get on in. All they needed was a ticket. So, yeah. So look up Castle Garden is also an interesting topic to write about and discuss. And I'm going to be talking about it in the book that I'm writing now. Now, a lot of it was family memories. And so I'm adding an awful lot of history to the book too. So I would say that it's about 50-50 family memories, which I've had to go ahead and check, and then other things that were happening, like what the whole immigrant experience at Castle Island would have been like for somebody coming in from this family came from England. So yeah, so it's interesting. I like to do research. I like to find out new things. And that's why you'll find all of my books are on a variety of topics.
You ever find one like, I mean, I know we talked about the Prohibition and your new book that you're going to be making, but is there one that you have that's either a particular interest of yours? Like, did you just come across something and be like, I'm going to write about this? Or did you have something that you wanted to write about for a long time and you finally got to?
Well, I started a chronology of Long Beach, and the first one was called Murderous Intent. And I like history to be factual as well as entertaining. And you can find such interesting people just by going through some primary source materials. For instance, in Murderous Intent, I talk about how small the police department was and how one officer had to go on out and check on a fella and tell him he could not have his daughter's coffin on his porch. And when he was asked about it, he said, well, I have so many kids and I had this buried, but then when we had a flood, the coffin washed up and I decided to keep it out of the ground in case there were more floods. And he said, and who knows, maybe one of my other kids would die and I could use it again, just put them all in together afterward. After all, they were siblings. So again, I try to make it entertaining as well as factual. So stories like that are ones that, definitely I have to go ahead and put in the book. So anyway, and then so after Murderous Intent, that covered about 1880 up until 1900. And then, covered 1880 up until 1920, because there wasn't an awful lot of stuff going on in Long Beach besides the guy with the coffin on the porch. And then Prohibition Madness was my next one. And oh boy, as I said, the population had gone from 55,000 to 126 just within a couple of years. And there was an awful lot going on. So after Prohibition Madness, I wrote a book basically from the mid-1930s up until the end of World War II, which was called Fighting Fear, and talked about what was going on locally. And then after that, from the 40s up until the 1970s, I wrote a book called The Red Scare, UFO, and Elvis. So it was talking about what was going on during that period of time. The Cold War, the duck and cover era, when, kids were told to duck and cover, when everyone was afraid that, Russia was going to attack us with the nuclear bomb.
Can I ask about that? Did you find that there were a lot of people, especially like media wise or journalistic wise, or just average citizens that were kind of questioning the communism thing? I have a big interest in the 70s and kind of the Cold War when it comes to the labeling of communism and the way that people were like you were hiding under your desk for when a bomb was going to fall, like, like that type deal.
Right. I remember doing that myself. Yeah. Duck and cover, it was called. Yeah, there was a big fear of communism, what was going on with McCarthy and being blacklisted, especially among performers, among writers. Yeah, you could go ahead and be taken off to jail. When I was really young, before we moved to California, I moved here when I was 7. I lived in Pennsylvania, and I still vaguely remember the FBI coming and taking off some of our neighbors. And we never found out what happened to them, but they must have been communist sympathizers or something.
That's so crazy to me looking at the FBI, like even the production code office that they had about the censorship in movies and films. I mean, when you were right, you wrote about Elvis. Elvis wasn't censored, was he?
Well, they tried to. That wiggle was too provocative for
You can't
many of the
censor the
older
king.
generation to deal with. Yeah. And they didn't want their young kids, associating with something like that. So, yeah, it was provocative.
You can't censor the king. The king is, I mean, that to me was interesting as when I was looking through Nixon, I saw him, a photo of Nixon and Elvis shaking hands. And that's just about Elvis. Elvis was involved in so many different things where I was like, man, most people would be like taking a nap in your free time.
Yeah. Oh, but then there were the UFOs that were being seen. That was a big thing. The head of Project Blue Book, actually, when he retired, he moved to Long Beach and he lived here. And so he was often questioned about the research that they found. And it's also interesting now. Have you watched the series? Is it Skywalker Ranch? That's on.
No, it's Skinwalker Ranch, my buddy TJ show.
Yeah. So you just wonder about, everything that's going on and whatnot. But back then, a lot of what were called UFOs were actually just test flights by the federal government over, spy craft and things like that. And they just didn't want the Russians to know about it. But there were a few that were a little bit.
You probably saw that peak up during the Cold War, especially. I've been through some of those UFO documents that they have on the government's website, and it's like the Cold War. They don't know if it's new technology. They don't know if they have to call it this or hide the technology that they have and call it UFOs just so other governments, because I think everyone was stealing each other's information at that time. So they thought if there was a spy in their midst, there's some documents that aren't even real documents, but they are in the archives because of the fact they were worried about spies coming in and leaking intelligence. They'd run off with the wrong information, which is just like, man, I'm looking through these stuff with like a historical lens, trying to look at the past. I'm like, is this real? Can I trust this?
Yeah, exactly. So, yes. So it's been an interesting journey that I've been taking through all different periods of history. So, I like what I'm doing. I'm retired now, and it keeps me active.
Do you find that a lot of people reach out to you to talk about some of the history of Long Beach? I would feel like if you're a kid from that area, you just want to know more about, I mean, no, it's not necessarily on the forefront of things, but having a blog and writing your books as well, too, is a really important way to get the message out.
Yeah, I get emails all the time from people that are asking me questions, or they'll find something in one of my books. For instance, in Prohibition Madness, I talked about Ralph McAdams, who was murdered on the Pike. And his niece reached out to me and she said, "Oh, I never knew anything about this happening to my uncle." And she thanked me so much about it and sent me pictures of him and other things. So, yeah, I do hear an awful lot from people that have read the book that might know more and send me updated information. Yeah, I work on a number of projects. One program that's been on PBS is called The Sky Blue Sea, which talks about Long Beach and early aviation and the Navy. And then another fellow has just reached out to me within the last week, and I'm going to work with him on a project on the 1910 Dominguez Air Meet. And so he wants to put together a program for PBS on that.
I mean, that's it. I mean, good thing you're getting press as well too when it comes to that. I mean, I'm still up. I can't. I didn't know about the person that was head of Project Blue Book even moving out to Long Beach. I'm surprised it doesn't get really mentioned a whole lot.
Well, you are mentioning it now.
Yeah, I
I
mean,
do mention it in my book, the Red Scare UFO and Elvis, and talk more about what was going on here in Long Beach and different sightings and whatnot.
I mean, any of the, I know you mentioned a lot of those sightings being like military aviation or something during the Cold War, but I mean, do you ever get skeptical on some of that alien stuff?
Um, Sometimes I do with what's being reported, but when you just look into the universe, you know that there has to be more out there than just us. So that they must be a nicer group because they haven't really interfered, I don't think.
Unless that's where Elvis got his songs from. I have no clue.
Oh, yeah, Elvis was an alien.
So
Let's
when
start
you
that rumor.
yeah, when it comes to honestly, his songs were out of this world. Come on now. No, but when it comes to the history of Long Beach, and I mean, you ever thought about being at least a tour guide or be able to help out with maybe be able to work at a museum when it comes to the factor of being able to talk to people? I mean, you are easily able, I mean, you easily talk to me. So I feel like you'd be good
Well,
at teaching other people.
I give programs, I give lectures, and I've been doing it for years. But I'm at a point, and I've been asked to be a docent. I've been asked to do all sorts of things. I do, but I've cut back on it because I am now retired. We have another home that's in Northern California that we spend a lot of time with, and I like to travel. And I've been saying no to people, and when it comes to doing lectures and things like that again. I'm retired. I'm just happy to write my 2 blogs a month for the local newspapers. I'm happy. I do work every year at the cemetery tour that the Historical Society of Long Beach does. So, and then people can come there and talk to me, give me stories, including ghosts that they might have seen. There was one woman that came to me that told me that she saw little gremlins that were hopping from tombstone to tombstone. And I just sat back and said, oh, yeah, that's really interesting. And there was another person that came and said, if you look over there where the mausoleum is, we were filming, and he gave me the name of the movie, which I can't remember. And he says, and as we were sitting there was a little boy that was up by one of the tombstones that kept, running around and whatnot. And he was there for quite some time. And he said, I went up there to check him out. He hid behind the tombstone. And when I went there, he wasn't there anymore. So, you meet an awful lot of people, especially when you're doing something at a cemetery.
I'd have to feel like if you you were looking up people's like homes or where there might be like a certain story that happened in their homes, how many people came to you about it, like an issue like, hey, did anybody mysteriously die in the house? Because I have some weird creeping at night.
Well, my first book, which I wrote for the Historical Society to raise money, was called Haunted Long Beach. And I was on their publication committee, and we sort of joked around. And I said, well, if you want to make money, you got to write about ghosts, because I had just been back at visiting Gettysburg, and there were all of these books on the ghosts of Gettysburg. And I said, and people were buying them. So they laughed about the project and whatnot, thinking this is not going to be, very reputable research. And I said, well, we can go ahead. I said I had found a number of articles in the local newspaper about ghost sightings. And so we decided, okay, we'll go ahead and we'll do a book on haunted Long Beach. So we put out flyers at all of our 12 libraries in Long Beach called have you seen a ghost lately? And we got back quite a number of responses. And to be sort of scientific about it, if you can be scientific about ghosts, we always ask that it be a first-person encounter. And it's very interesting. One of the questions we asked was, is this the first time you've seen a ghost? And people said, no. So I came to the conclusion that there are certain people that have this gene, this psychic gene, that allow them to look into other realities, or whatever you want to call it. But remember, I mentioned that we went ahead and we put in addresses whenever events occurred, including obituaries and including murders and suicides. And when I wrote Haunted Long Beach 2, because everybody wanted a sequel to that book, I was able to pinpoint a number of ghosts related to suicides or murders that had taken place at different places in Long Beach by address. So that's what makes this book a little bit different, is that we were able to go ahead and document what had actually happened.
Now, do you believe in ghosts?
I have had so many people come to me in earnest and tell me about what they have seen or experienced that I definitely don't believe that they were lying. I do know that they were experiencing something. So yes, I do believe in ghosts.
I've spoken to some people with some experiences, and I definitely, the way that they talk about it, is there's something where it's like, I don't think you're lying, but you saw something or you experienced something. And whether it's a memory thing, I have no clue. But I don't know. I keep a little bit of faith out there, try and be a little bit optimistic when it comes to that type of thing. I think it's interesting. It's much like the alien thing. I don't want to think we're alone in the universe. That'd be a terrible and dumb way to live.
Well, look at what they're discovering now with quantum physics, quantum mechanics, that there's 9 parallel universes to ours. And who's to say that when we die, we just don't go into one of those? And that there are beings in those dimensions that we don't know about yet that try to communicate with us and are able to get through. In the Haunted Long Beach books that I did, there was Haunted Long Beach 1, and then there was Haunted Long Beach 2. In Haunted Long Beach 2, I did some research, and there was a psychic by the name of Jane Roberts who communicated with an entity called Seth, and they're called the Seth books. And she would relate what Seth was talking about different topics and whatnot in different realms. And one of the things that he said was that it takes a certain amount of energy within the earth to go ahead and project myself to you. So energy is what it's all about. We're energy beings. We don't, our energy does not cease to be once we die. It's just transformed. That's the second law of thermodynamics. So anyway, we're getting off of prohibition now. We're getting into ghosts. So
you've written plenty of books that we could probably spend hours talking about, but I appreciate the time you gave me to talk about the Prohibition books and also a couple of your others as well too. But is there a place where people can find your links?
Oh, my website, ClaudineBurnettBooks.com. ClaudineBurnettBooks.com.
Do you have any social media links?
Oh, I have a Facebook page, yeah, for my books. Yes, I do. And it's just Claudine Burnett Books on Facebook for that.
And when it comes to anybody out there listening that would want to go check out your books as well too, I think, this definitely learning a little more about you is good. But is there any messages you want to leave to anybody out there that could be listening?
Well, unfortunately, an awful lot of bookstores have closed recently, especially here in Long Beach. So the Historical Society carries my books, but if you really want to buy them, Amazon or Barnes and Noble are the sites to go to, or the publisher to go ahead and buy the books. Oh, and by the way, all of the profits from my books, as well as my speaking engagements and research, goes towards digitization projects of area newspapers. I think it's very important for people to be able to study, primary sources, and digitization is the only way to go ahead and do it. And so there's an awful lot of material out there that needs to be digitized, and that's what my money goes towards.
How much does it cost to digitize something?
You'd have to ask the people that I give money to. UC Riverside has a program where they're digitizing California newspapers, and it's available online for everybody to go ahead and look at free of charge. I don't know. I just give them an amount of money that I gather, and it goes to whatever cause, to whatever thing that they want to work with.
Like I said, I'm big into the assassination of JFK. I've spoken to like Bob Blakey from the House Select Committee on Assassinations. I've spoken to many members of the Assassination Records Review Board, and it's always just fascinates me when they scan in documents or where you find a collection of archives of some like college or something like Baylor University has a bunch of documents related to the Kennedy assassination, which is just like, how many did you guys print? Like, I mean, in that time, I think in the past year, been over 64,000 things of documents. And I keep thinking, I'm like, oh, this has to be the end of the barrel. Nope. And then you still find another one, or someone has it in their basement or something.
Yeah, you can. Yeah, that's very true. And the thing with digitization is that you can go ahead and search through like keywords and other things like that, which makes it easier if you're just looking for one particular topic to go after. So, yeah. And so that's where all of my money goes towards.
A lot of it being online helps people that necessarily don't live close by to be able to access the information as well too.
That is very, very true. In fact, in this latest book, I was looking at some of the archives from Britain for my book that I'm writing now, and to go ahead and fill in details about what their life must have been like in England before they decided to immigrate to the United States. So, and the family home actually, I was able to find in a British newspaper articles about what it looked like all the way back in 1810. So I just found that was remarkable.
Well, look, I'm going to link all your links in the description for people to be able to find. And I appreciate the time you gave me to talk on my show. And thanks everybody for listening to this episode of Out of the Blank podcast.